Schuyler Colfax wasn't born in South Bend, but he was a South Bender through and through. He lived in the town before it was incorporated, always called it his hometown, returned to the place after his time in Washington, D.C. had ended. Colfax biographer Ovando James Hollister described Colfax's relationship with South Bend this way when he wrote his Life of Schuyler Colfax in 1886. For many years, South Bend has suggested Schuyler Colfax, and Schuyler Colfax has suggested South Bend. More inseparable the man and the place than Washington and Mount Vernon or Jackson and the Hermitage. These were merely homesteads, but South Bend, in its relation to Schuyler Colfax, represents substantially a single family, of which he was a member and the consummate flower. It was a symbiosis, the man and the place and the man, both inextricable from one another. Not that there weren't temptations. In 1848, Colfax, then a newspaper publisher, had an opportunity to buy and run a newspaper out of Lafayette, Indiana, the Tippecanoe Journal. The move to Lafayette would have been a step up for the aspiring political star. Lafayette's population was double that of South Bend's, and the prospective paper's circulation was double his own. It was an opportunity not only to make more money, but for the aspiring politician to put his name and his opinions in front of a lot more people. It would have been a no-brainer, an obvious choice, a step on an entrepreneurial and political ladder that anyone else might have made unthinking. But if he was anything, Colfax was a thinker, and this is what he thought about the prospect of the move to Lafayette. Even with the profits and riches in view, there comes up such a feeling of attachment to South Bend, such an unwillingness to remove from the circle of friends and acquaintances around me in St. Joseph County. Later, there came an opportunity to buy out the Cincinnati Gazette. If Lafayette had been a step up, then Cincinnati was just about an elevator ride to the very top. He didn't need to explain what he meant when he wrote, "You know what my answer is." By 1850, Colfax's rapidly rising star had caught the attention of power players across the Midwest. There were attempts to seduce him to Detroit, Indianapolis, Chicago. He rebuffed them all, even shunning the advice of Horace Greeley, who thought the Indianapolis opportunity made the most sense for Colfax and his growing ambition. At the time, Horace Greeley was one of the most influential journalists in the country, the powerful editor of the New York Tribune whose political connections and editorial voice could make or break careers. His advice wasn't casual. It came with real weight. Greeley wrote to Colfax that he should buy out and take over the paper down in the Hoosier capital, unless he intended to live and die in South Bend. Of course, Colfax didn't buy that Indianapolis newspaper, and as for Horace Greeley's promptings, maybe Schuyler Colfax looked at those words and thought to himself, "Why, that is exactly what I intend to do." Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series we are going to dive into the life of South Bend's own Schuyler Colfax. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's catch up with Schuyler Colfax in his 20s. And if you'll remember from our last episode, he was just recently married and was still in the midst of a personal battle against what he wanted for himself, a career in politics, and what his mother absolutely didn't want for her son, that very same career in politics. It was supposed that Colfax had been preparing and studying for a career in law, and Colfax even claimed the same for himself on a few occasions. But in his most honest moments, he confessed that he almost never picked up his law books. that more often than not, he couldn't bring himself to the reading or studying of law. As you would imagine, those habits never brought him any closer to being a lawyer. He had a heart and a head for politics. He always had. But he was also devoted to his mother. Remember, she'd been 17 when Schuyler Colfax was born and was already widowed. Her first child had perished the same year little Schuyler was born. As a young man, Colfax was grateful for and aware of all of this, and for as much as he seemed fit for politics, he was also very devoted to his mother. During his 20s, he might have struck a strange sort of compromise, working as a newspaper man, not a lawyer but also not a politician. It didn't mean he wasn't involved in politics. After all, Colfax wrote for and edited Whig papers, espoused Whig views, lionized Whig policies. He was very much a political figure, but per his mother's wishes, he was not quite a professional politician. So what did it mean to be a Whig back then? In the 1840s, being a Whig meant you believed in things like building roads and railroads, using government to grow the economy, and making sure Congress, not the president, had the real power in Washington. Whigs liked banks, business, and progress. In short, Whigs believed in a strong, active government that helped the country grow and stay united. But the Whig Party was a coalition party, filled with both Northern abolitionists and Southern slaveholders. The slavery issue was not a primary plank in the Whig platform, and in the 1840s it was one of those things where both halves of the party simply agreed to disagree. Let's keep that last part in mind, because soon enough, the problem of slavery is going to become bigger than the kind of thing that could just be ignored. By the time he was just 20, Schuyler Colfax was operating as a kind of shadow editor of the South Bend Free Press, a paper with an overtly Whig agenda. Colfax wrote articles and opinions of his own and vetted and edited the articles and opinions of others. What he did not get in those days was a byline, in no small part because the newspapers of those days didn't typically carry bylines. The only name on the paper was the name of the owner, and Colfax wasn't the owner of the paper. Yet. That would all change in 1845 when Colfax, now 22 years old, teamed up with an investor named A.W. West to buy the paper for themselves. They changed the name to the St. Joseph Valley Register and took on a subscriber list of not more than 250 paying customers. In the first issue of the paper, now fully beneath his pen, Colfax put clear stakes in the ground, writing as follows: "Custom demands and inclination requires that we should set forth as briefly as possible our intentions as to the future course. In politics we shall be inflexibly Whig, believing those principles to be the best and safest and wisest for the administration of our government." Colfax would clarify his views in print. He believed the government had a responsibility to make public improvements, even accepting that it might need to take on some level of debt to do so. In regard to slavery, Colfax in 1845 was a man who abhorred the practice, and who maintained politically that slavery should not be permitted to spread to new states as they entered the Union, but he was not yet ready to make the political statement that the federal government should abolish slavery altogether, although he did hope for the day when that would be feasible. There is plenty of room to speculate about why Colfax started out as a newspaper man. Maybe to placate a mother who didn't want her son to be a politician, maybe to build himself a higher platform knowing that one day he would become a politician. Or maybe it was just because he was good at it. As a writer, Colfax was gifted. As a newspaper man, he was excellent. It took just 4 years for the circulation of the Register to quadruple in size, from 250 subscribers to 1,000. He took over an operation that was running at a loss and turned it into a source of profit. And all of this at a time when most newspapers were run for political gain, not financial windfalls. Throw out everything else about his life for just a second, and Schuyler Colfax still remains one of the most important figures in the history of South Bend just for his work in the newspaper. Most of what we know about South Bend's history from 1845 to 1855 is only because Schuyler Colfax bothered to publish it. He might have made a successful lifelong career as a publisher if he were so inclined, but of course he wasn't. When we return, Schuyler Colfax finally embraces his destiny, and as we head into the break, I leave you with an advertisement taken verbatim from the very first issue of Schuyler Colfax's St. Joseph Valley Register, dated September 12th, 1845.
Dysentery! The season is at hand when bowel complaints are prevalent, but those complaints are easily controlled by Whittenmore's concentrated vegetable syrup, to be found only at A. Delano and Company in Mishawaka and J. Brownfield and Company in South Bend. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
Even though he wasn't working as a practicing politician, Colfax's career as a newspaper editor only served to make him more prominent in political circles. By 1850, the St. Joseph Valley Register was the largest circulated Whig publication north of Indianapolis, and everyone in Hoosier Whig circles and across the Midwest knew exactly who Schuyler Colfax was. Colfax was chosen as a delegate to the Chicago Harbor and River Convention in July 1847, a collection of men that included Horace Greeley, Henry Clay, Martin Van Buren, Lewis Cass, and a young Abraham Lincoln. Colfax had known many of the luminaries coming into the conference, but he would know all of them by the time the gathering ended. Colfax had been elected secretary of the convention. Of all the stars at the convention at that time, it was probably Henry Clay who shone the brightest. A towering figure in American politics for decades, Clay had served as a Speaker of the House, Secretary of State, and a perennial presidential candidate. He was best known as the architect of the major compromises that held the Union together, earning him the nickname the Great Compromiser. More than anyone else, Clay embodied the ideals of the Whig Party: economic development, internal improvements, and a belief in the power of Congress over the presidency. Colfax admired him deeply, and Clay's vision of a strong, principled, and pragmatic national government would leave a lasting imprint on Colfax's own political philosophy. One survey would later rank him as the 31st most influential American of all time. The only non-president political figure ahead of him is Alexander Hamilton. And if you're local to St. Joseph County, it's also worth noting that Clay Township is named after him. That the 24-year-old Colfax was in a room on something like equal footing with these political luminaries was quite an accomplishment. Professionally, he was still just a newspaper editor from South Bend, but he'd already become a kind of power player in the party, even though he'd never held an office, and indeed had yet to seek one. That last part would change soon enough. It was 1848 when Colfax was finally tempted by the voices that had been pestering him to run for office, and so he did, as a candidate for clerk of the Indiana House of Representatives. This might have seemed like the moment when Colfax finally gave in to the political wishes that had been in his heart since the beginning, the moment that he would have to look his mother in the eye and tell her that he was a politician now. But then, not so fast. Colfax lost the election and confessed later that he had never really expected to win. It's all speculation, of course, but it's possible that Colfax ran for the office to placate his pleaders, knowing that in the end, it would come to nothing. Either way, Colfax was still in South Bend, still editing his paper, and still yet to make a paying career as a politician, although it is worth noting that he had, by this time, given up the pretense that he was pursuing a career in law. This is when other pleaders began banging on his door, encouraging him to buy out larger papers in larger towns, to build his resume and his platform in places other than South Bend, Indiana. Colfax would not hear of such an idea, and does not appear to have given much consideration to any of these offers. But despite all of it, His star only continued to rise within the Whig Party. Colfax was a delegate to the 1848 Whig National Convention, where he generally favored General Winfield Scott and generally disfavored General Zachary Taylor. Colfax's voice was not loud enough to win the day, and Taylor was nominated by the convention, despite Taylor's refusal to publicly claim that he held any Whig principles. Colfax was right to be suspicious of the whole ordeal, and although Taylor did win the election, he was the last Whig to win the office, and the party would be all but dissolved within 10 years. It might have seemed the end of Schuyler Colfax's political career, over even before it properly began. Instead, it was just the first of many beginnings. Colfax maintained his position as a Whig as long as he could, attending an 1850 convention as a Whig delegate to rewrite Indiana's state constitution. Among his chief goals was to make sure the new constitution explicitly disallowed slavery. This measure passed, but Colfax was frustrated that many of his other goals were tabled or voted down. Colfax proposed that Indiana make a statement to denounce the treasonous whispers from the South. The state did not. Colfax argued fervently against the voices that sought to prevent new black settlers from moving into Indiana, and he lost that argument too. But his argument deserves to be heard all over again now. "We ask you to treat them with humanity," he said, "and not to crush them as you would vermin out of your sight. But if you will not do this, let no man on this floor speak of the cruelties inflicted on the race in the southern states, the slave factories of the African coast, or the horrors of the Middle Passage. Your mouths will be stopped, the utterance of your condemnation checked, for by your own solemn and deliberate acts you declare the Negro a brute, by excluding him from the commonest, the poorest, the humblest privileges of human beings, the right to live, and to possess the means of living, purchased by the sweat of his toil. Let us do equal and exact justice, regardless of creed, race, or color. If we value liberty, let us not step beyond the Declaration of Independence and declare its sublime truths a living lie." If he was anything, Schuyler Colfax was a man of conviction. His fiery argument fell on deaf ears, and he knew it would fall on deaf ears, but he made it anyway because he knew he was in the right. When Schuyler Colfax accepted a Whig nomination to run for the United States Congress in 1851, it was that speech that doomed him to lose the election. When confronted with this truth, Colfax made himself as solid as a rock. "These are my convictions. I cannot sacrifice them, and would not for 50 terms in Congress." One day, Colfax's convictions would pay off, but that day did not come in 1851. Colfax lost the election, and a year later, when he was mentioned again as a candidate for the same office, he instead declined the honor. By the end of 1852, the Whig Party was breathing its last breath. It would be dissolved by 1854. If Schuyler Colfax was ever going to serve properly in office, he wasn't going to do so as a Whig. When we get back from the break, Schuyler Colfax joins a new party and runs for election in 1854.
Jacob Roof has become sole proprietor of South Bend's Oyster Saloon, where you'll find the best fresh oysters in town, hot or cold, stewed or raw, accompanied with smoked and pickled pork. Find the Oyster Saloon at 119 Michigan Street and tell them Jacob sent you. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
By the beginning of the 1850s, Schuyler Colfax's Whig Party was already on shaky ground. They'd been beaten, they were weak, and now they were bickering with one another about the same firestorm that was about to tear the nation in two: slavery. In earlier years, Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs tended to agree to disagree about the institution of slavery, finding common ground in other shared opinions, like their universal opposition to Andrew Jackson and his propensity for ignoring the Supreme Court and his willingness to openly defy the Constitution. But by 1854, Jackson had been out of office for 17 years and dead for 9. That meant there was a lot less common ground and no common enemy to bind the Whigs together. And now, there was no greater debate than slavery. For his part, Colfax had been optimistic that slavery would be ended someday, but like most of the rest of the Northern Whigs, he lamented that there seemed to be no political solution that would bring about emancipation. Southern slavery, as deplorable as Colfax found it to be, was something that would have to be abided. But by the 1850s, slavery had become the issue of the day, not just one among many. Northern Whigs had held their noses long enough, tolerating slavery in existing Southern states so long as it didn't spread to new states and new territories. The expansion of slavery was the line in the sand that Colfax and other Northern Whigs refused to cross. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, a piece of legislation that would allow new states to decide for themselves if they would allow slavery. In other words, the expansion of slavery was here. Northern Whigs tried in vain to hold their line in the sand while Southern Whigs ran enthusiastically to the other side. This was not the kind of issue that would allow for compromise, and the party dissolved in a hurry. Colfax did not hold back his disappointment when the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed on May 30th, 1854, and he took up his editor's pen to lambast Colonel Norman Eddy, congressional representative of the district that included South Bend. Eddy had voted in favor of the passage of the act. Among other things, Colfax quoted a list of resolutions passed at a people's meeting in Valparaiso that called each of those who voted in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act a traitor to his country, to freedom, and to God, worthy of everlasting infamy, and that his name should go down to posterity covered with odium and associated with that of Benedict Arnold. Colfax wrote, in his own words, that Eddy had failed to carry out the true theory of democracy by voting his own wishes instead of the overwhelming interests of his constituents. In the same breath, he wondered whether the people of the district would be able to drum up resistance enough to displace Eddy during the congressional election, now just 4 months away. For years, the dominant parties had been the Democrats and the Whigs. Eddy was a Democrat, and now the Whigs were no more. Did Colfax know, as he wrote his op-ed in the wake of the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that he was going to run again? Did he know that he was going to be Eddy's challenger in that 1854 election? Either way, that's exactly what happened. It was this, the Kansas-Nebraska Act more than anything else, that persuaded Colfax to throw his own hat back into the ring. And if it hadn't been for the act, and Norman Eddy's role in passing it, then Schuyler Colfax's professional political career might have been very different indeed, might not have ever started at all. At the beginning of 1854, Colfax was not seriously considering a congressional run. In fact, he wrote later that his Whig newspaper, written by his own pen, was prepared to endorse Eddy, the Democrat, for a second term if Eddy would have only voted against the controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. So when Eddy voted in favor of the bill, Colfax had a reason to run, and more importantly, he had an issue to run on. Now, he just needed a party. The Kansas-Nebraska Act threw Indiana's political landscape into shambles. When the state Democratic Convention met that May and formally offered its support to the legislation, several dissenting Democrats left that party. Displaced Democrats commiserated with dissolved Whigs, and negotiations led to a quickly assembled organization called the Indiana People's Party in the summer of 1854. By the end of the year, 9 Hoosier congressmen would win election from the People's Party ticket, largely based on their opposition to the expansion of slavery. In Indiana's 9th District, there would be a showdown. Democrat Norman Eddy versus People's Party Schuyler Colfax. Eddy was no dummy, and he knew he faced long odds. Colfax was widely known and wildly popular. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was nearly universally loathed across northern Indiana, and it was the first, second, and third most important issue to most of the voters he would need to win. Eddie didn't expect he would be able to win those voters, and he was correct. Colfax waxed Eddie at the polls, and in the fall of 1854, Schuyler Colfax won his first election. He was going to the United States House of Representatives. It might have seemed like a culmination sometime coming, but then Colfax was still just 31 years old. In every possible way, he was just getting started. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode will follow the newly elected Schuyler Colfax all the way to Washington, D.C., and the fraught years ahead of the American Civil War. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.